only at Joseph A. Bank.
We're looking into the issue of whether or not people who participated in the June the 3rd Democratic primary crossed over into the Republican primary this Tuesday night. And we've already found more than 1,000 examples of that in one county alone.
That is Mississippi Republican Chris McDaniel, also known as perhaps the worst loser in recent political memory. 3 days since his GOP U.S. Senate primary loss, one confirmed by almost everyone but Chris McDaniel, the Mississippi state senator, is still on the warpath over how Thad Cochran won re-election. Specifically, Cochran's last-minute appeal to cross over Democrats, many black Mississippi residents who were legally allowed to vote in Tuesday's runoff. As the people behind UVA's Center for Politics note in a recent Politico piece, although nearly every county across the state saw greater turnout in the June 24 runoff, generally speaking, the higher the black population of a county, the greater the boost. Imagine that, a Republican reaching out beyond his base to secure an election and then winning because of it. I feel like I read something about that after the 2012 election, a report or an autopsy or something. Something about how that's what the party should be doing to win. Well, I guess their autopsy now needs an autopsy. To help us with that, we have Angie Maxwell. She teaches Southern Studies and Political Science at the University of Arkansas. And we also have Jason Johnson. He's a professor of political science at Hiram College and the politics editor for Source Magazine. And Angie, I want to start with you. You've been saying that actually black voters being pragmatic and taking their destiny into their own hands in primaries is not a new phenomenon in the South.
Thanks for having me, Crystal. It's not a new phenomenon. African-American voters in the South have had to be very astute for generations. They have been put in a position where they're often dealing with one-party politics within the state, and they're voting between the lesser of two potential candidates, neither of which may be their ideal position, right? And one of the things we haven't looked at in this race, in my opinion, is what is the African-American view of the Tea Party in general? Because Chris McDaniel did a strong job of positioning himself that way. And we know from data that we run here at the University of Arkansas that the African-American kind of average view of the Tea Party on a 0 to 100 scale, with 100 being the most favorable, ran in 2010 at about 26 points on average and dropped in 2012 to 19.
Wow.
So if there's anything more unfavorable than perhaps Republicans, is Tea Party.
It would be the Tea Party. Well, and Jason, my sense is that that's not only about issue positions, although it is about issue positions. I think it also has to do with some of the rhetoric that comes at times out of the Tea Party, and that they certainly heard from Chris McDaniel. Let's take a listen to a little of some of the, I would say, coded language that Chris McDaniel used.
Before this race ends, we have to be absolutely certain that the Republican primary was won by Republican voters. There is something a bit unusual about a Republican primary that's decided by liberal Democrats. Today, the conservative movement took a backseat to liberal Democrats in the state of Mississippi.
This is a man who also has spoken at events with neo-Confederates. Are some of those really bad throwbacks to the past, that sort of racially coded language, is that part of what motivated African Americans here?
Oh, definitely. I mean, when we can add a new phrase to racial coding, thousands of irregularities. I think irregularities means black people. So we can add that now. I mean, look, this is a guy who said that, he made comments about Trayvon Martin. He's made comments about black people in general. He's made comments about President Obama. He's a sore loser because he doesn't understand that at your core, as a politician, you're not only seeking everyone's votes, but you have to represent everyone too. So all of his language and all of his commentary not only turned off black voters, but it even turned off white moderate voters in Mississippi who saw his kind of behavior as the kind of thing that would just embarrass the state if that guy ends up in the Senate.
And Angie, one of the things that I actually found really promising here is when I saw the Cochran strategy of going into African-American neighborhoods and touting things like his support for the ag bill and his support for food stamps, I was frankly worried that there would be a white backlash pushing white voters in the direction of McDaniel. It doesn't seem like that happened.
It doesn't seem like that happened. I mean, with the county level data that we have right now, we don't think that happened. But the other thing we have to remember, too, is that, you know, Cochran reached out to these voters. Now, will that translate into any policy changes? We don't know. But about 50% of African-American Democrats in this report no contact from the Democratic Party. And so there is an opening there, possibly because it feels like the state is already red. It's going to take a long strategy, multi-election strategy for Democrats to gain back support potentially. And so you're leaving kind of this, you know, group that is not contacted by anybody. And when we know that about 1 out of 10 doors that you knock on, you turn a vote your way, is kind of the common wisdom. And if you're doing it in the absence of any other information and you're touting things like the federal dollars that you've been able to bring to Mississippi, that's a message that's going to resonate.
It's a message that I hope resonates with both parties, that you can't take anyone's vote for granted. And Jason, looking bigger picture, this is the first time we've really seen a Republican, when threatened with a Tea Party challenger, instead of running as far to the right as he possibly can, actually moving to the center to pick up a broader, expanded electorate. I was taking a look at where else this would be feasible. There are a lot of states in the South that have the same sort of open primary system where this would be a possibility. You've got 35 states around the country where you either have open primaries or the kind of hybrid system that they have in Mississippi. Do you think you're going to see more Republicans employing this strategy?
Not at all, even though they should. I mean, look, this is what Reince Priebus has been talking about for 2 years. I sat in meetings with him as he talked about this sort of thing to African-American journalists and analysts, saying this is what the party's going to do. But you see from the backlash, it's not going to happen. People are already calling Thad Cochran a betrayer and calling the black voters who voted for him Uncle Toms from Rush Limbaugh. I don't think you're going to see a lot of Republicans who are going to be interested in employing this tactic, this crazy tactic called actually getting different kinds of people to vote for you. So it should happen, but I don't think it's going to.
Yeah, Angie, what do you make of that? Do you think that this is a strategy that could be used successfully other places in the South?
It's a strategy that can be used successfully if it translates into real action by people like Thad Cochran that benefit these communities that have they're suffering the worst from unemployment rates. They're women, the African-American women with the lowest, you know, even lower than white women of how much they make on the dollar compared to men. If it translates to policy, like George Wallace, as terrible as George Wallace was on race, his last election for governor, he's winning with almost 80% of the African-American vote because he turned around and delivered real, pragmatic economic advantages for that community. If it doesn't translate, it will not work a second time.
That's right. Well, and Jason, one of the things that the local NAACP president in Mississippi is already saying is, hey, maybe you could help us to amend the Voting Rights Act. We saw the Supreme Court striking down an important provision in the Voting Rights Act. Do you think that Thad Cochran is going to feel pressure from the constituency that is responsible for him keeping his seat in Washington?
I really hope so. I hope that this makes him more sensitive. I hope he doesn't act like the guy who's like, I'm going to forget about my prom date. I was only with her because she drove me here. You know, I think if he actually decided he was going to pay attention to all the voters who put him in the position that he's in now, it would benefit. This is a guy who has an 11% rating from the NAACP as far as civil rights legislation. He got a 0 rating from the ACLU at one point in the past. And so he's got a lot of work to do. If he were to just wake up one day and say, I will just stand against some of the anti-African-American policies that the party's been putting forward, that would be a huge progress from some of the things he's done in the past.
That would be huge progress, and as Angie was pointing out, voters will be watching and they will hold him accountable.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Jason Johnson and Angie Maxwell.
Thank you.
And
Thank
a
you.
Reid alert on the woman from the suit.